International Trade. I'm the head of international trade here at the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce, and I'm very happy to welcome you all today to discuss a very topical issue, which are US tariffs and the impact of UK trade. I'm very grateful to our speakers of today. We have a very packed agenda. I'm just going to tell you a bit more about to start. So we're going to have a brief introduction about who we are, the Chambers Trade Academy. We're going to have an overview of the US tariffs announcement. And we're going to have a Q&A session with our panelists. So who we are, this is an initiative by selected chambers of commerce across the UK to offer free virtual sessions covering everything related to export, import, customs, and business opportunities globally. Combined, we represent about 18,000 businesses altogether across all sizes and sectors. Across the chamber network, we offer a wide range of international trade support, ranging from international trade events, readiness assessment, export, import, customs training, customs regulatory consultancy services, market entry services, including partner finding, commercial debt recovery, foreign exchange, credit checks, certification services, and customs brokerage. So across the board, we are here well positioned to support you. And today, we want to start off, before we officially get into the presentation of today, I just wanted to launch a poll about what's the current impact that some of you businesses have felt so far on the US tariffs. So if I can give you a few seconds to please answer the poll, that will be great. I know some of you already answered this during the registration, but if you can provide us some indication, will be fantastic. Thank you so much. Bravo. Well, it's changing a little bit from our earlier poll. We're seeing a bit more of the negative impact coming through. But generally speaking, it's also a bit early to tell for many businesses what the issues is. So thank you. So now I would like to welcome William Bain, our head of trade policy at the British Chambers of Commerce, so he can walk you through some of the US tariffs and some of the impact on global trade. So welcome, William, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much indeed, Susanna, and hello to all of you joining from across the UK and perhaps across the world. It's been a very busy time, I'm sure, for all of the panelists here, but we're delighted to be here to offer our perspective and perhaps some illumination on what can be at times a fast-moving and difficult to follow set of new trade arrangements. If we maybe go through a timeline, first of all, of what has happened over the last 6 weeks or so. So the first hit of tariffs onto UK companies came on the 12th of March, and that was in relation to the duties on steel, aluminium, and derivative products. Now, these tariffs went quite a bit wider than those in President Trump's first administration because of the application of them to derivative products. So that's meant that everything from nuts, screws, fasteners to construction goods that have some steel or aluminium within them, or furniture that has a steel frame within it, are subject to these additional 25% import duties. And the president justified these on the basis of national security, said that the tariff rate quota that had applied since 2022 was not working, and therefore it was terminated on that date. So from that point, all UK steel, aluminium, and derivative products of either alloy has been subject to these 25% duties. And as we know, that's having quite a considerable impact on supply chains right across the UK and into the United States. On the 2nd of April, we had the announcement of the reciprocal tariffs that we'll dive a little deeper into in a minute. And then on the 3rd of April, that's when the 25% additional duties on UK and global automotive vehicles entering the US came into effect. So that was on top of the previous duty of 2.5%. So that means the new duty rate for those exports is 27.5%. And that's had quite a serious impact, as we've seen, with some car manufacturers ceasing sending goods to the US for a period whilst they work out how things would work out. And of course, those duties are prospectively going to be extended on the 2nd of May to car parts. So reaching further into the supply chain in the UK for parts going into the US for production into US made vehicles there. On the 5th of April, in terms of the UK, that's when the 10% additional import duties on affected products took place. That's the global baseline rate. Now, it's important to say that steel, aluminium, derivatives, semiconductors, and also automotive, pharmaceuticals, copper, lumber, timber, energy are excluded from the scope of that. So there were some exemptions. But lots of other sectors, everything from food and drink to textiles to industrial goods, electrical goods, are facing 10% additional import duties on top of the previous duties from the 5th of April. Now, the UK, in terms of the assessment that the US administration made of our reciprocal tariff, got the lowest possible assessment. Like Brazil, we got 10%. Other countries got a far bigger assessment. So the EU at 20, Switzerland at 31, and of course, some of the countries in Southeast Asia in the high 30s or even into the mid 40s. And so for those countries, for one day, the reciprocal tariffs came in, the chunk above the 10%, but was suspended on exactly the same day, the 9th of April, for 90 days until early July for non-retaliating countries. China was in a different position, so the increase in duty after a few increases went up to 145%. That's since the start of the year. So that's on top of existing MFN duties from the start of the year. It includes the fentanyl 20% duties, which came in two tranches as well. So you can see that really we're looking at over 80% of China goods trade into the US being subject to an extremely high tariff wall. And as we'll see in a few minutes, China has reciprocated in turn. And so the two largest economies in the world now raising strong, very high tariff walls to each other's goods. And that's having an impact on global trade across the board. On the next slide, we move into April. Just back a slide. There we are. So on the 11th of April, China's retaliatory tariffs, which went up to 125%, came into effect on all US goods imports into the country. The same day, we then had an exemption from the US on smartphones, flat screen TVs, solar cells, flash cards, memory drives, solid state data drives from the scope of the reciprocal tariff. So that was a welcome development, and I think entirely predictable given the impact it would have had on US consumer prices for those goods and also sourcing chains. The EU decided to halt its first set of retaliatory tariffs. So that was due to take effect on the 15th of April. It's now been suspended until the 14th of July. And just a week ago, we had a very important decision from the US Trade Representative's Office on something that was increasingly concerning global traders. And this was about the prospective shipping landing charges. So the US had talked about introducing charges of up to £1.5 million per boat landing at a US port for lines which had China-made boats in their fleet or on order. And that was irrespective of whether it was a non-China made boat that was actually landing at a US port. So the new plans put in place for consultation and due to take effect in October from USTR will exempt non-China made boats from that. So that is a good thing. The scope of the charges for China made boats is much, much reduced in the matter of thousands, but for very high volume boats, of course, there is a tonnage reference point. So the liability for China-made boats could still be considerable. And of course, if we look at many of the global shipping operators, including those registered in Europe, then a significant proportion of their fleet is China-made boats. So this is still going to impact upon the logistics around exports and global trade. There is a consultation that is opening from USTR's office, and our sibling organization and partners at US Chamber have been very helpful in making pro-business, pro-growth, pro-trade points into USTR. On the 3rd of May, we're still due to see the extension of the 25% auto duties to auto parts. So if you take in overall the scope of that first tranche, just about the cars and light trucks, and now onto the auto parts, that is an estimated $460 billion worth of cars and car parts covered by these new duties. And this will cover everything from engines to lithium batteries, tires, shock absorbers, onboard computers within cars. So it's really going to reach quite far down into supply chains. And there will be another tranche of UK companies that will be affected by these new duties if they come in as planned on the 3rd of May. On the 8th of July, the 90-day suspension period for non-retaliating countries on the reciprocal tariffs above the global baseline rate of 10 is due to end. So we will see whether deals are made between the 70 or more countries that are negotiating with the US administration right now, or whether that period may be extended. But that is purely up to the president and the administration, whether they would choose to do that. And on the 22nd of November, there is also a deadline for USTR to report into the president about tariffs on copper and copper derivative products as well. So that's another risk that's coming down the track in terms of extension of this. And the next slide, please. So in terms of the global baseline, 10% has applied to all imports in those affected sectors, unless your goods are in the excluded categories from the 5th of April. And we are seeing that applying different tariffs prospectively, if no deals are reached, it is one of the biggest shifts in global goods trade since 1947. And there is a tension between this pattern of doing trade and tariff policy and WTO rules, which are meant to treat all countries the same under the most favored nation principle. We're also expecting announcements on further sectoral tariffs. So there could well be tariffs coming still on pharmaceutical goods that would be across the board in nature. There could well be announcements on semiconductors, so that concession that we talked about a few moments ago for electronic goods, that might be very brief because there could be semiconductor tariffs announced in the coming weeks, which would include those goods, and those would apply across the board. We're also expecting further measures around critical minerals as well. It's really important to state that these tariffs are not stacked. So for steel and aluminium, it's 25%. For the automotive, it was 25% on top of the existing MFN. So it is not those duties plus an extra 10%. So where there are across the board tariffs, those are not stacked with the reciprocal tariff. And that's important to think about when speaking with your freight forwarders and customs agents. On to the next slide, please. And maybe skip this one, please. And also, I think it's worth pointing out something which is due to happen again in early May, unless there is some change of heart from the US administration, and that is the abolition of the de minimis threshold on goods of China and Hong Kong origin entering the US. So the US administration will start enforcing customs duties on low value consignments which contain goods of China origin, either sent by sea freight or by international postal services. So there's a couple of different rules here. So goods that are sent from China or Hong Kong by post will face additional ad valorem duties of 120% of the value of the postal package, or a specific duty per item of $100 from the 2nd of May until the 31st of May. And then from that point, either the ad valorem rate of 120% of value or $200 per item will apply, whichever is the higher. Now, one of the things we're seeing and finding out from companies contacting Greater Manchester Chamber and chambers across the UK is that there is still an absence of definitive guidance from US Customs and Border Protection about the whole panoply of these tariff measures. So particularly for the abolition of the de minimis threshold, we're looking for further guidance. And we raised this with government last week. We had a meeting with the Export Minister, Gareth Thomas, and there are issues that we hope that DBT and HMRC will be able to liaise with US Customs and Border Protection about to make sure we get as light touch an approach as possible. But we've been very clear what US Customs has been doing in the last month, which has been ramping up significantly its enforcement processes. And so you may well have to prove the origin of the goods are not from China and therefore comply with non-preferential rules of origin to demonstrate that the goods would only get the 10% if they're goods in the reciprocal tariffs sectors and not be subject to the much higher tariffs, which are obviously applicable to goods from China. So this is going to be another tension that comes into trade. And we know there are many traders in the UK who are packaging and sending over goods which are of China origin into the US market, and they will be affected by the abolition of the de minimis threshold from early next month. We maybe skip over a few slides. The full presentation will be in the deck, and maybe if we skip over until there's one in particular I would like to share. Yeah. Yeah. If we keep moving on this. And yeah. And again, please. And again. I think it might well be the last slide in the deck. Yes. So if I can finish on this, please, that would be terrific. So the BCC has been successful in achieving 5 outcomes over the last few weeks, thanks to great contact from Greater Manchester and members across the UK. So 5 goals we were able to achieve. And of course, this week, we heard additional announcements from the Chancellor in Washington that the Trade Remedies Authority will be given an extra personnel and new resources to tackle the consequence of this utter change in global tariff policies, potential trade diversion. And where that involves unfair competition, then of course analysis on surge of imports and dumping needs to be very speedily done and acted upon. So the TRA will have a new route to speak to businesses more directly to get information about where import surges or potential dumping is happening, and the ability to draw up recommendations for ministers to act upon. So I think that was a really considerable outcome. Pleased that we were able to get that from the Chancellor. We also welcome the increase in UK export finance lending capacity from 60 to 80 billion, with 10 billion earmarked for the effects of US tariffs on UK companies. So that was again something that the BCC asked for, and also an increase in capacity for the British Business Bank's Growth Guarantee Scheme, which will allow loans of up to £2 million to be made. So, some excellent things achieved by the Chamber's network in very trying circumstances over the last few weeks. But fundamentally, what businesses are saying is we need to get an economic partnership agreement with the US. Tariff relief is important, really important for affected companies. But all of our eggs are not in one basket. It's also clear from what members have been telling us, they want to look at the wider European neighbourhood, potentially see closer trading terms with the EU and reduce trade barriers in that market, and also to make the most of the opportunities with our partners in the CPTPP trade zone, which of course is 99% zero tariff, and also the wider Indo-Pacific trade zone as well. That's really important. That tripartite approach to international trade, potential for trade diversification for UK companies, that is in a sense the best hedge that companies can have in these difficult times. So thank you, Susanna. And with that, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, William. So now I just wanted to say there is an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So if you want to put your questions on the chat box, we will also come to you in due course. But now I would like to introduce you to our panelists. So as you heard, William, Head of Trade Policy at the British Chambers of Commerce. We also have Chris Southworth, Secretary General at the International Chambers of Commerce. Caroline Barraclough, Partner Global Trade Lead at Deloitte UK, and Alessio Lencioni, Head of Product and Strategy at Stream. So all of you are pretty busy at the minute with just reason, and I would like to thank you again for being here and sharing some of your insights to the traders that are joining us today. So to start off, IMF and the World Trade Organization have actually downgraded some of the growth, both economic growth at the global level, and WTO also forecasts that there will be a decline of trading goods about of 0.07%. So are we going to see, and this is more for Chris and William, do you think that we are going to see some of the economic slowdown that we saw during the COVID, post-Brexit time? What are your thoughts on this? If I go first to Chris.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you. Just to give an idea of the perspective that I'm providing, the International Chamber of Commerce represents 45 million companies in 170 countries. And we also co-chair B20 Task Force on Digital Transformation and the Commonwealth Legal Reform and Digitalisation Programme. So, we're well connected into that international infrastructure. We're a strategic partner to the World Trade Organization. So I'm going to give you a sort of global view on some of this to put it in context. First of all, this is nothing new. The US have been effectively stalling and withdrawing from the international trade system in varying shapes and forms for the last 8 years. What we're now seeing is a massive acceleration of disruption from the US. But you've got to put things in perspective. The US has the ability to disrupt the global system, and obviously for the UK economy, we will probably be harder hit than others, given the integration of the economies, particularly the services economy, between the two countries. But the US only represents 13% of global trade. The other 87% of global trade don't want a tariff war. They don't want to disrupt trade any more than we already have disruption. And we need to focus on that 87%. It's the reaction of the rest of the world is where we need to really put our focus. Just to give you a couple of facts and figures, a recent SIPS survey last week, in fact, of global procurement managers, 35% are already rerouting sources of supply chain products outside of the US. So they're taking trade out of the US and they're buying from elsewhere in the world. And we're seeing that elsewhere around the trading system. Companies are adapting to the current system. The US is only 0.6% of global shipping, and we've seen a 60% drop in Chinese shipping to the US. So what we're sort of seeing is an adaptation response to what's going on in the US. But the most important point here is the rest of the world is reacting. Our message is don't overreact. This is time for cool and calm heads, but we all need to adapt to ensure the multilateral system is fit for purpose for the 21st century, and that's where most of the world's minds are focused. We're also seeing an intensification of discussions in places like ASEAN, Africa, Middle East, and Europe. No surprise, because that's where the commonality is, that's where the real trade relationships are, that's where the highest value volume of trade is. In terms of the UK, if I can bring it down to a UK context, our message to government and to industry is quite simple. The UK priority is growth. It's about reform. We are pushing hard to reform the trade finance regulatory framework to unlock £22 billion in working capital. We can do that. But it's also about ensuring that the UK economy and companies have the agility, the resilience, the transparency, and are able to reduce the risk and cost in the current global system. And the big opportunity in front of us, where this is actually, in a sense, a real catalyst, is to digitalize trade transactions. We're seeing companies now reduce trade transaction costs from an average 2 to 3 months to 1 hour. We're seeing costs come down 80%. We're seeing workforce productivity up 60%. And we're seeing shipping costs down 18%. You know, these are big numbers. The challenge for us in the UK is to make sure that all companies are benefiting from all of those benefits. But it's all about now giving companies the ability to better manage and control cash, to untrap the cash in supply chain so you can get your money in and out of markets quicker. You get better transparency to know where your supplies and products are, and can move those quickly. That's where digitalization really kicks in. In the UK context, we have probably the best legal framework in the world. We're very lucky in that sense. There's nothing stopping us from a legal point of view in doing this. We have probably the best framework and plan in terms of the roadmap to digitalize UK trade and the plan for growth that we presented to government. We have the tools to do it in terms of guidance for companies, and we have some of the best innovation resources, but we need to leverage all of those to help companies become more agile in a world that is obviously increasingly unpredictable. And then we also need to engage at multilateral level. That's really, really important. The UK is a major pragmatic voice for open trade. There are a lot of countries looking to the likes of the UK, along with a lot of other mid-sized economies or middle economies, as they're called, like Japan, Singapore, Australia, Canada, and others, to navigate a path through the next 4 years where we're going to see increasing amounts of disruption and unpredictability. But for the UK, this is a big opportunity to broaden our export markets, modernize and digitalize our trade systems, make sure that companies have the agility that they require to operate in the environment in which we're in, and to work with that global community and government at multilateral level to make sure that we are helping shape that future, as well as obviously work with the US, which of course we will continue to do. But we have to now take on board that the world order is changing. The G77, which is effectively all the emerging markets, are all working to some degree together. The BRICS Plus is now bigger than the G7. To give some idea, Asia is now a much bigger market than the more traditional markets. And the UK is a sort of pragmatic voice in all of that, at providing that we're all working with government to leverage the opportunities and ultimately use all of that to drive growth at company level and national level.
Thank you. William, anything to add to the question in terms of, are we likely to head back to an economic downturn because of all this?
Well, Susanna, we've seen some interesting forecasts from important global economic organizations in the last couple of weeks. So firstly, the World Trade Organization last week forecast that global Growth in goods trade would decline by 0.25% this year. Previously, and just in the autumn, it forecast 3% growth in global goods trade for 2025. The IMF, in its economic outlook published earlier this week, said that for trade overall, global trade growth overall, which includes services, there will still be growth this year, 1.7%. But obviously, quite a lot of that is being supported by services growth. We should say that, thankfully, the trade war has not spread to services. The EU were looking at some measures under their anti-coercion instrument, which could have affected services provided by US tech companies into the EU market. And that, I think, could have accentuated the trade war even further. So that hasn't happened. And if you look back at what the WTO was saying late last year on services growth, we're seeing services trade globally grow by 8-9% a year. So there should still be real optimism that those services, not intrinsically linked with the supply of goods, can continue to see strong growth this year. So yes, an economic boulder in the water, perhaps a reduction in growth. We saw the IMF reduce the UK's growth forecast to 1% for this year. The BCC's forecast is 0.9% for this year, so in line with that. But I think it's about retaining our calm, keeping the resilience that we know that companies on this webinar and across the country have been doing, and ensuring that these difficulties can be resolved, and that where adaptation into new markets can be had, either into the wider European neighborhood, including Middle East and North Africa, or into the Indo-Pacific market, that those transitions can be done as well. So I think we should have a sort of guarded optimism that the road might be rocky, but firms are resilient enough to get through it and thrive at the end of this disruption.
Thank you. Well, we have quite a few questions on rules of origin. So maybe I can go to you, Caroline and Alessio. Obviously, a lot of to do with China, and maybe it's worth just kind of talking more about what you guys are seeing on the ground. And because we have a lot of questions on are medical devices excluded from the current tariffs, if they are importing into the EU and then re-exporting to the US, but the goods are originally from China and then just adding components. So I think there is a lot of questions and lack of clarity about rules of origin. So if I can go to you, Caroline, and maybe you can shed some lights on this.
Yeah, more than happy to start. And hi, everyone. Yeah, so I mean, I suppose when we take it back to basics, and a lot of these questions kind of come from that, it's considering, what we see is people kind of, I suppose, run before they can walk. So when we look at the origin point, I suppose the first thing to do is to consider what your tariff classification is. And we hear the word tariffs quite a lot, but ultimately what will drive the tariff paid is obviously the customs classification and then the customs origin of that product. So I think the first thing to do is consider what your classification is and whether that is definitely captured or not, because we have seen already misclassification of product making kind of a product fall in or out. So it's really important now that there are significant impacts to just make sure that that's sorted. And then if you look at origin, you've got sort of preferential and non-preferential, which William has already sort of touched on. But again, what applies preferential origin wise or non-preferential will depend on what that tariff code is. So that will drive what the product specific origin rule is, and what will kind of determine whether something originates or not in one of the areas sort of covered. And from a broad point of view, when you look at non-preferential origin, that will fall into either what we call wholly obtained, so produced, grown, born in a country, or the last substantial transformation. And again, the specifics around that will be driven by the tariff code. So really important to kind of look at that code first, then look at the preferential and non-preferential origin rules linked to that code, and then determine from there kind of what the impacts sort of might be. And then when we look beyond that sort of point of things, we are sort of very carefully considering it's those two elements that drive the tariff. And then if there is a tariff element, how can you drive down the value for duty by looking at valuation? So it's very kind of, in terms of the customs pillars, very much kind of classification, origin, and then looking at the value from there.
We know that the US has a lot of they refer to the substantial transformation. So can we just, and I think, William, those are in your slides, what cannot be included as substantial transformation? Because I think we have quite a few traders on the call today, which are just simply just bringing some already kind of finished products, maybe doing some bits and bobs, and then re-exporting to the US, which will not be considered substantial transformation. So maybe we can dig out more what the substantial transformation and what is from the US, standpoint.
Yes, I mean, this comes from the basis of binding rulings which US Customs and Border Protection have made, but also some court cases as well. So it's really a sort of legal picture as well. So basically, you must change the nature of the good. Simple assembly, repackaging is not going to qualify as substantial transformation. The goods must be intrinsically different in nature from the components which go into making them. Say there's no hard and fast rule. US Customs and Border Protection are sovereign in how they'll look at this. But you've got to think about, is there some high level skill involved in the assembly of the goods? Does it involve things like welding? But goods which simply, are pre-welded, pre-assembled, and are snapped together with a very simple process might not make the cut. So there are 11 factors that I think are set out in a previous decision from US Customs and Border Protection, and those will be on the slide deck for people to consult after the webinar.
Thank you. Now, Alessio, you're working day in and day out with exporters, and how are you seeing these companies adapting to the new tariff changes, and especially cross-border? Some of these tariffs might have hit some of the shipments that, they sold them before all this came about and then got to the US. How are you dealing, or what is it that you're seeing on the ground in terms of how companies are dealing with all this?
Thank you for the platform, Susanna, and thank you for the question. I think to be slightly more pragmatic and factual, as you're saying, in terms of dealing with these attributes on the ground every day, when there's a US tariff shift or a tariff shift in any region, I think the natural instinct for many businesses is to wait, hope for exemptions, and understand and see if those costs simply can't just be passed on to the end consumer or to their ultimate customer. And I think it's also the question about the materiality. I think the question that was posed previously in terms of we hear the word tariff and we panic, ultimately does send shiver down some of our business spines. But I think largely and more importantly, it's to understand what is the relativity of that actual implication on the supply chain. And what I mean from that perspective is if a business is importing that item in, is it going to drive up their cost significantly? Are there ways around it? And where we're seeing a growing number of businesses take different routes to get ahead of these tariffs are structurally reassessing their supply chains. I think that's arguably one of the more natural points, whether it's rerouting shipments via alternative ports, considering country of origin strategies and working with suppliers to adjust their Incoterms, and businesses that ultimately adapt early tend to shield their margins and protect their competitiveness. So the real question for companies isn't how much will this cost us, but rather how quickly can we pivot our supply chain when it does. The winners aren't necessarily the ones who avoid the tariffs, but the ones who build flexibility into their logistics models from the start. And I think that's quite important. So understanding from the onset, when you're quoting out a client from a purchase order perspective, ultimately being able to assess and see what is this origin going to be, or what are these tariffs relative to the origin going to be. Going back to William's point, a general rule of thumb that we ultimately always say to our clients is that repackaging and routing something through the UK, even though the country of origin might be something that's non-preferential, doesn't constitute enough. There needs to be a material change in the item. And I think without going into the extremities of what that looks like, I think we all know within our own operations, within our own businesses, what that materiality actually is. To give a more practical example, if we have to consider a vehicle is composed of multiple different parts that have multiple different countries of origin, regardless of what those pieces might ultimately be. The composition of those products altogether, and if you look at more intrinsic parts of inward processing, if you are to import those goods into the UK, transform those items to create an ultimately different item that has a different ultimate function, institutes the difference of the product. And I saw there were many questions, and I think these are the type of questions that we deal with our clients, and we're always happy to answer, is whether or not that is applicable. But I think the most realistic thing from our side is that the persistent belief that global supply chains can be reshaped at the stroke of a pen, where you're switching a supplier or rerouting a shipment to renegotiate a term, isn't necessarily that reality. It takes time. So I think it's about how you structure it from the onset to be adaptive. And I think the more time that passes from when someone is asking you the question and when that ultimately passes through, and I think we've seen it in this over the last couple of weeks. A more personal anecdote is we had a client that was shipping something from the UK to the US via air freight, where we're talking about an in-transit time of no more than 3-4 days. Between when that shipment was placed and when it landed in America, those tariffs changed twice relative to that specific item. So it's about being agile and also being, I think, more than anything, transparent with the client in that everyone's in the same boat. I think it's a very fluid environment at the moment, and we ultimately urge people to not panic, but to have the structures in place. And we're always happy to assist businesses to put those structures in place from a practical perspective, not a theoretical perspective, in terms of actually how it's implemented, to be able to adapt quickly to what those changes ultimately look like.
Thank you so much. So another question is, and this is aligned to the rules of origin, what Chris mentioned earlier. I mean, yes, US is important and plays a big role in global trade, but it's not the only player in this. And we need to encourage diversification both on exports or supply chain. The UK is a big player, but which will be the key regions, or when you are working in terms of diversification of the supply chain, Caroline, this is a question for all of you. What would you suggest for companies to start looking into in terms of that diversification? Because supply chain, looking at the supply chain right now is very critical, but we know that the US tariffs are impacting not just China, EU, is impacting 195 countries across the globe. So even if you're looking at supply chains, you also need to consider all those implications. So if I can ask all of you just to give your quick snapshot of what you think, UK companies should be looking at, or which regions in terms of markets for such diversification. And I'm very much in light on the key sectors that are being impacted and impacting UK trade. So if I start with you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, what we're saying is we're massively under trading into a whole bunch of regions, actually. We've become very binary in our trade over the last 10 or 15 years, primarily into the US and Asia, but we're missing a Middle East to some degree as well. If I can just say Latin American trade, the consumer market in Latin America is double the size of the US, just to put it in context. And the trade numbers into Latin America are extremely low. So we're really under leveraging that market. I would certainly say that we should be looking to Latin America. It depends on the products, obviously. But absolutely Latin America. Africa will be the biggest consumer market in the world over the next 10, 15 years. But we're almost nowhere in Africa and not laying the groundwork to be more present to capture that opportunity. Africa are way ahead of us on tech in some areas, to give some examples. The Commonwealth, if you look at it in comparison to the US, where it's a -10 tariff disadvantage, you start with the Commonwealth with a +21% advantage. To put that in context. So, I would look certainly at the usual markets, Asia, obviously, Middle East, obviously, but certainly start looking at Latin America more intensively, and definitely be laying the groundwork for Africa to be positioned correctly in the future, and definitely leveraging the Commonwealth market where there's a huge opportunity.
I think to add to that, Chris, as well, one of the things that we see is as companies are gathering kind of data and business intelligence on this, is actually they don't even realize sometimes where they are already multi or dual sourcing. So again, look at that current landscape and look at, per SKU, per commodity code. Actually, is there already some, diversification that they're not even aware of? So almost that kind of pre-mapping to then feed in, Chris, some of those things that you've mentioned.
Yeah, and I fully agree with Alessia's comments there. It's about getting, obviously, a lot of the world is in reactive mode, and obviously companies will be in reactive mode at the moment, but it's about shifting mindsets, getting from reactive to proactive, thinking about that longer term picture around the supply chain and de-risking that supply chain, and getting that process going now. Even if we're dealing with US tariffs at the moment, there are lots of other options in terms of diversification of those supply chains. And in the UK context, there's a lot of markets. If I keep going back to Latin America, you've got some very Anglophone-friendly markets there, but we're almost nowhere in terms of UK presence. But there's a great willingness to work with us. It depends on the size of the company, depends on the size of investment, depends on the sector. Some companies can shift quick, and others take longer, obviously, depending on what the company is. But absolutely, we should be reviewing supply chains and ensuring that our trade routes and supplies are consistent and over the longer term, and getting into that proactive mode and taking the opportunities in front of us to certainly modernize trade in the way we do trade than the way we do it at the moment. And all of that will put us in a good place in the longer term over growth. So we kind of need to do this anyway, but this is a big catalyst, and we shouldn't be overly distracted by the US, even though the US is obviously a key economy for us. We need to look much bigger and broader than that.
I think just to add on to Chris's statement, if I can, I think this is a two-pronged approach. I think there's attributes, and similar to the point that was raised now, is that there's the aspects in terms of how do we increase the places of procurement for items that are ultimately going to be sold onto other markets. So it's about looking alternatively. I think the world of production, we've seen that shift happening away from Southeast Asia quite significantly in the last 4 or 5 years, with lower reluctancy on Chinese businesses, and also how that production has shifted to alternative markets, whether that be India, certain parts of Africa, different countries within Southeast Asia, and also looking internally within Europe, bringing back certain amounts of production locally with increased roboticization in terms of advanced manufacturing and the likes of, depending again on the industry. I think that's looking at it from a supply perspective. I think we've almost become used to certain methods and countries of sourcing items without necessarily looking outwards. And speaking within my own experience, understanding how certain markets are actually very self-reliant and self-sufficient and have surplus capacity to also export. I think from a European standpoint, we always anticipate that low-end manufacturing for componentry, we have to look outwards to ultimately import that. But the number of markets that can service us in those aspects are a lot broader than we honestly believe. And I think there's so many components that the different chambers and trade organizations are putting in place to ultimately open up our eyes from that is quite significant. That's it from a supply perspective. But I think in terms of where our businesses can ultimately sell their products, Chris, I agree with you completely. I think Latin America, Africa, and certain parts of Asia are significantly underserviced. Again, as I'm sure you'll agree with me, the complexities there come within the fact that there's no unification in terms of economic area, regulations into certain countries can ultimately be more complicated. However, within our space, in terms of trade compliance and practicality, we do see certain markets, specifically in South America as well as Africa, and even areas as far-flung as Southeast Asia, whether that be Singapore, Japan, Korea, that are actually very simple to operate as foreign businesses without having to have a local presence, where you can import your items through relative ease. And I think that's more from like a macro perspective and a long-term perspective, where countries are also changing. Just yesterday, I read how Argentina has dropped a lot of trade regulation for foreign businesses to start importing different products. That's a market that can be much better service than what historically it's been. It's always been known as a very difficult country to do international trade with, specifically when importing items into Argentina. But I think even closer afield, if we have to look at the European Union, I think a large focus of ours over the last 4 or 5 years has been focused on doing trade into the EU. I think post-Brexit, many businesses still have, I think, bad experiences of trying to move goods into Europe post-Brexit. I think a lot of businesses, and we can see this factually, have made certain missteps that have either cost them a lot of money, made the process highly inefficient or uncompetitive in many ways. And I think as a short-term goal and as low-hanging fruit, there's a well-versed buyer that's familiar with UK goods, with UK products, with UK quality. And I think we also cannot underestimate the brand UK in the foreign market, especially in closer markets such as the European Union, where there are systems in place to make a tax-efficient distribution of goods into Europe, a fully compliant distribution of goods into Europe, and lastly, an efficient and competitive distribution of those goods, whereby we're looking at transit times of a couple of days in closer European markets, and no more than 7 to 10 days in further afield European markets, and that's moving via road transport. We've got to look at those strategies in place to really get those markets well serviced and better serviced in many industries.
Thank you. I think we have a lot of very specific questions. Again, this will come back to what Caroline was saying, because there is, without commodity codes and understanding very well what is it that you're importing and what is the process that is happening, whether it's in the UK or Europe or China, it would be very difficult to give you a straight up answer right here, right now. But what I will suggest for those companies that are asking us very specific questions on their products, from pharmaceutical, medical devices, semiconductors, that you approach your local chamber with these specific questions so we can look at them in more detail and provide with commodity codes. What is your supply chain? Where are you, importing from? What is it that you're doing? What is the process and where it's being re-exported? So we can look into more detail about the tariffs. Also, one question that keeps popping up is, and I don't know if either of you can kind of come up, is companies are asking if there is any useful resources where they can look at these tariffs and get some understanding of how their goods are being impacted, because they feel like there is no so much information, and I feel like the US tariff tool, it's not quite, I don't think it's been properly updated, but I don't know if you might be able to add up something to that in terms of resources that traders can use. Caroline or Alessio?
I mean, I'm happy to take it, and then Alessio do add in. I think there has been some reticence from everybody to publish anything in terms of the way it's moving so quickly. So that is probably why there's quite limited information in terms of being able to do that. I would say, similar to what you said, reach out to your local contact, or if you deal with anybody like Deloitte, to try and find out what that is. I think that's why we've seen some kind of reticence to publish, both from the authorities and from other organisations, just in terms of it moving so quickly and that sort of information becoming outdated. And it's so specific, as we've said, to the product and to the commodity code linked to that product. So that would be my response. I don't know whether, Alessio, you've got anything to add to that.
Caroline, I agree with your statement. I think, and taking your news from credible sources where it's been vetted and it has been validated, I think is the most important aspect. Where we look for, and this is an internal process that we do, where we look for most recent information is actually reports or notices posted on the White House webpage for initial information. That more than anything is confirmation with reports that we are seeing in the media. Until there is any form of confirmation on that website, we don't act. I think it's very difficult, and I think as it's been explained today, we need to keep calm from a business impact perspective. But in terms of taking that next decision, I think our chamber network is very well versed in being able to not only give us a clear and factual answer, but also pointing us in the right direction if and so need be, if action does need to be taken at the immediate standpoint. So ditto to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much. I think we're running out of time, but before we leave, if I can ask each one of you, very, very concise, one tip that you will give to the traders and to prepare or navigate these difficult times. Just one quick, takeaway that they can act on.
I mean, mine is know your current landscape. We see so many organisations acting on things without actually knowing what the current landscape. There's loads of data out there. There'll be internal data, but also customs authority data. Look at what the current landscape looks like, and then act and make no regret decisions based on that.
William?
Yep, have a strong two-way dialogue with your local chamber in terms of getting the latest information, in terms of new guidance coming from US Customs or new changes in policy that have been confirmed by the US administration, but also letting the chamber know what the impact of these things are, because we have that dialogue with government where we can feed into both those things being negotiated and also that guidance that government can try and secure from US Customs and Border Protection to bring more clarity to what can be a fast-changing situation.
Thank you. Alessio?
The truth is the complexity of tariff shifts has outpaced most companies' ability to react manually. So spreadsheets, email threads, siloed systems don't really cut it anymore. We've seen a clear pattern emerge where businesses that handle the tariff shocks the best are the ones that are using technology to centralize their supply chains, duty, and landed cost visibility. So my assessment would be that when your systems are connected and you run simulations, spot anomalies, and the model and cost impact of those tariff changes before they leave the warehouse, I think is the ultimately that is the answer. It's to streamline that. So in other words, you just don't react to tariffs when they hit customs clearance. You plan for them when the purchase order is raised. So that shift from reaction to anticipation is where digital trade platforms, something like what we've been able to design and implement, has become a real competitive advantage for certain businesses. And that's what I would say: centralize, become adaptive, and being more agile.
Thank you. And Chris?
Yeah, I would say probably three things. Diversification, I think, is crucial in all forms, whether it's supplies, export markets. Generally, digitalisation, I think, is a huge opportunity to, again, de-risk the supply chain, increase the ability to be more agile, particularly financially, but also get more transparency and reduce cost and risk across the supply chain. And I think, to reinforce the points already made, engage. I think now's the time to really engage through either trade associations or direct into government. But we've got to get the voices of buyers and sellers into the places where the decisions are being made in order to make sure that we are all moving in the right direction and making the right decisions in terms of shaping the future of global trade. This is a catalyst to doing that, and we should absolutely be leveraging that to the full max, because the UK has a huge role to play in global trade and how we all respond to the US policy environment.
Thank you so much. Right. Well, I thank you all of you for being available today to join us on this webinar. Chris, Alessio, William, Caroline, it's much appreciated. You share very useful insights, and I hope all the delegates have found it very useful. Before I let everybody go, I would like to launch one last poll, which is more about to ask you what you think the UK response should be about the US tariffs. So just a quick one. From a snapshot poll that was done, I think last week, William, from the BCC, the clear message is that businesses do not want any retaliatory actions, but just keep the diplomatic channels open. But we would like to know whether that kind remains the same sentiment remains as of this week. So thank you so much, everybody, for contributing to this poll. It's much appreciated. And I would like to finalize just saying how important it is to rely on your local contact, your local chambers, and the different partners. We had some of them here today. In Greater Manchester, we also have the Business Growth Hub that can help some of these companies with some information and support. So make sure that you are tapping into these different organizations. As William said, we are also very, very keen to hear from businesses how you're finding trade, what are the main barriers that you're finding, what are the key sectors or products that that are finding the most barriers. And yeah, just we are here also to help you diversify and look into those markets. As Chris alluded, our trade with Africa is less than 2% at the minute. And I think with Latin America, it's pretty much on the same level. So there is a lot of other markets that we should be looking at. We hope that you found this webinar useful today. We have another session coming up in May, which is looking at ESG and the global sustainability landscape, which is also impacting many traders. So please make sure that you contact your local chamber to register for that. Without further ado, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you so much to all the speakers again for being here. And it is clear that we might have to be running a few other sessions on this topic, so please stay tuned and be alert of what your local chamber is doing. Thank you so much.